This isn't a story I read in a book. This is my life and the strange, long road it took. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes justice doesn't come like a thunderclap. It arrives like a quiet frost decades later when no one is watching. The ballroom at the Four Seasons in Philadelphia smelled of money and self-congratulation. I was holding a flute of sparkling water, trying my best to look like I belonged among the tailored suits and glittering evening gowns. From my position near the back wall, I had a perfect view of the man at the podium, the Honorable Judge Julian Croft. He was accepting a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Pennsylvania Bar Association. His silver hair was perfect, his voice a rich, confident baritone that had swayed juries and intimidated defendants for 50 years. I watched his mouth form words like integrity, truth, and duty. My hand tightened around the object in my coat pocket, a small, leather-bound volume, its pages softened by decades of touch. It was my own annotated copy of the trial transcripts. The Commonwealth versus Arthur Vance, my trial. The one that had cost me everything. Croft paused for effect, his eyes sweeping the adoring crowd. For a fleeting second, his gaze snagged on mine. I saw a flicker of something, not recognition, not after 40 years. More like the idle glance one gives a piece of furniture that seems out of place. Then he looked away, dismissing me completely, and delivered his sanctimonious closing line. "For the law," he boomed, his voice resonating with false humility, "is nothing if not the unwavering, unrelenting pursuit of the truth." The room erupted in applause. A standing ovation for a man whose entire career was built on the most profound lie I had ever known. And in that moment, watching him bathe in the unearned adoration, the cold, patient ember that had glowed in my chest for half a century finally found its oxygen. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. Before Julian Croft reimagined me as a criminal, I was a historian. A professor at the University of Pennsylvania, to be exact. My life was a comfortable one, measured in semesters and punctuated by the scent of old books and autumn leaves on Locust Walk. My world revolved around two things: my work, which was the study of American economic history, and my wife, Eleanor. She was a librarian at the Fisher Fine Arts Library, a woman with a mind as sharp as her wit and a laugh that could make the dusty old halls of academia feel like home. We had a modest row house in University City, filled with more books than furniture, and a life built on shared passions and quiet companionship. I was 32 years old, passionate about my research, respected by my colleagues, and deeply in love with my wife. Life was, for all intents and purposes, perfect. The accusation, when it came, felt like a sentence from a badly written novel. Embezzlement, the university claimed nearly $200,000. A staggering sum in 1975 had been systematically funneled from a research grant I administered. I was the sole signatory on the account. The paperwork, they said, was undeniable. My signature was on every fraudulent transfer. I remember the confusion more than the fear. It was impossible. I hadn't done it. I tried to explain that it had to be a mistake, a clerical error of monumental proportions. My department head, a man I considered a friend, looked at me with cold pity. The university administration, eager to avoid a larger scandal, needed a scapegoat, and the paper trail they'd been fed led directly to my office door. That's when I first met Julian Croft. He wasn't a judge then, of course. He was a young, hungry assistant district attorney with slicked-back hair and eyes that seemed to see every interaction as a contest to be won. He carried an air of supreme confidence that bordered on arrogance. In our first and only meeting before the trial, he sat across from me in a sterile interrogation room, my shell-shocked public defender beside me, and smiled a predator's smile. "Professor Vance," he'd said, leaning forward, "let's not waste each other's time. We have the signatures. We have the account ledgers. A man like you, smart, respected, you just got a little greedy. It happens. Sign a confession, name your accomplices if you had any, and I can make a case for leniency." I stared at him, dumbfounded. "There are no accomplices because there was no crime. I didn't do this." Croft's smile tightened. He leaned back, the picture of condescending patience. "Okay, Professor, we'll do it your way. The real architect of my ruin was a man named Walter Slach, a senior administrator in the grants department. He was a mousy, forgettable man with a serious gambling problem, a fact I wouldn't learn until much later. He had perfected the art of forging my signature, a skill he used to bleed the account dry over the course of a year. He was the one who, upon realizing the annual audit was approaching, created a false trail that implicated me, then presented his discovery to the university board. He became the prosecution's star witness. The trial was a blur of humiliation. Croft painted me as an arrogant academic, a man who believed his intellect placed him above the rules, who used a complex web of accounts to fund a lavish lifestyle I didn't have. He presented my research trips to archives in London and Paris not as academic necessities, but as extravagant holidays paid for with stolen funds. My life's work was twisted into a motive for a crime I didn't commit. Eleanor sat in the front row every single day, her face a mask of strained composure. I could feel her belief in me wavering, not because she thought I was guilty, but because the sheer weight of the so-called evidence Croft presented seemed insurmountable. How could the world be so wrong? Croft's masterstroke was his handling of Walter Slach on the stand. He portrayed him as a diligent, unassuming bookkeeper who had uncovered the betrayal of a man he once admired. He guided Slach through a labyrinth of forged documents, each one bearing what looked uncannily like my signature. Slach, for his part, played the role of a lifetime. He stammered, he appeared reluctant, he even shed a tear as he spoke of his disappointment in me. Croft didn't just present a case, he told a story. And his story was more believable than my truth. I remember standing in the campus quad on a crisp October afternoon, just before the trial began. It was a week before my arrest. My world hadn't yet shattered, but the cracks were showing. I was on administrative leave, and the whispers followed me everywhere. Eleanor met me by the Ben Franklin statue, her hands buried in the pockets of her tweed coat. "Arthur," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "I don't care what they say. I know you. This is a nightmare, and we're going to wake up." I held her, drawing strength from her conviction. That was the last truly peaceful moment I would know for 30 years. 2 days later, 2 stone-faced detectives appeared at the door of my lecture hall in the middle of a seminar on the Panic of 1893. They didn't speak. They simply stood in the doorway until I finished my sentence. Then one of them said my name. The silence in the room was absolute. 20 young faces stared, their expressions a mixture of confusion and shock. The walk across campus, flanked by the detectives, felt a mile long. Every passing student, every colleague, every face I saw was a nail in the coffin of my reputation. That was Croft's design, I realized later. He could have had them pick me up at home quietly. But the public arrest, the perp walk through the world I treasured, that was part of the narrative. It wasn't just about convicting me. It was about destroying me. It was the first act in Julian Croft's masterpiece of lies. And I was just beginning to understand how much more I had to lose. The trial itself was a masterclass in theatrical prosecution. Held in the grand, intimidating courtroom of Philadelphia City Hall, it felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a public execution of my character. Julian Croft was the ringmaster. He moved with a liquid grace, his voice rising to a crescendo of moral outrage, then falling to a conspiratorial whisper when he wanted the jury to lean in. He was brilliant, I had to give him that. He was a storyteller, and he had cast me as the villain in a story of greed and betrayal. My public defender, a young, earnest man named Ben, was hopelessly outmatched. He was a foot soldier armed with a pocket knife fighting a general with an army. Ben believed in my innocence, but he was a creature of facts and precedent. Croft dealt in emotion and narrative. Every time Ben would try to pick apart a discrepancy in the financial records, Croft would reframe it as my own cunning attempt to cover my tracks. "Look at the complexity, ladies and gentlemen," Croft would say, gesturing toward a mountain of ledgers. "Is this the work of a simple bookkeeper making an error? Or is this the meticulous design of a brilliant academic mind, a mind that thought it could outsmart everyone?" The centerpiece of his case was, of course, Walter Sala. On the stand, Sala was the picture of wounded sincerity. Croft would ask him questions with a gentle, almost paternal tone. "Mr. Sala, can you tell the jury how it felt when you first saw the discrepancies?" Sala would dab his eyes with a handkerchief. I didn't want to believe it. Professor Vance was a titan at the university. I thought I had made a mistake. But you checked your work, didn't you, Mr. Sala?" "Oh, yes. Over and over. I prayed I was wrong. I sat at the defendant's table, a cold rage building in my stomach. I watched the jury. They were captivated. They saw a humble public servant and a fallen intellectual. They saw the story Croft wanted them to see. I kept whispering to Ben, 'He's lying. Look at his eyes. He's lying.' Ben would just pat my arm and say, 'We'll get our chance on cross-examination.' But when Ben's turn came, Sala was prepared. To every question about the forgery, he had a deflective answer. 'I'm not a handwriting expert,' he'd say meekly. 'I just report what the documents say.' To every question about his own access to the accounts, he'd reply, 'My duties were purely clerical, supervised by Professor Vance.' Croft had coached him to perfection. He was a wall of pathetic, believable denial. The most damning piece of evidence was a single handwritten memo authorizing a wire transfer of $50,000 to a bank in Switzerland. The memo said, 'As per our discussion for the acquisition.' It was vague, but paired with the transfer, it looked like a smoking gun. The signature at the bottom was a perfect imitation of mine. 'My expert says this is your handwriting, Professor,' Croft said during his cross-examination of me, his voice dripping with theatrical disbelief. 'Are you saying he's wrong?' 'I'm saying I never wrote that memo,' I said, my voice shaking slightly. 'I've never even seen it before.' Croft turned to the jury and gave them a look of pity. 'Ladies and gentlemen, a man who has spent his life studying history is now trying to rewrite his own.' Eleanor's face was pale in the gallery. I could see the doubt beginning to eat at her. Not doubt in me, but doubt in the system, doubt that the truth had any power in this room. The worst part was the loneliness. You're sitting there, the focal point of all this drama, yet you are completely powerless. Your life is being debated by people who don't know you, based on lies told by a man you barely knew, all orchestrated by a prosecutor who saw you not as a human being, but as a stepping stone. During a recess, I saw something. Just a flash. Croft and Sala were standing in the hallway, partially obscured by a marble column. I couldn't hear them, but I saw Croft give Sala a reassuring pat on the shoulder. Then he subtly slipped a small object into Sala's hand. A cough drop? A mint? I don't know. But the gesture was intimate, conspiratorial. It was the gesture of a director giving his actor a final note before the curtain rose. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a witness being coached. This was a conspiracy. They were partners in this fiction. I told Ben, frantic, "He's in on it, Ben." "Croft knows he's lying." Ben just sighed, the exhaustion of a losing battle etched on his face. "Arthur, I can't tell the judge I saw a suspicious pat on the back. We have no proof. It's your word against theirs." And he was right. I had nothing, just a gut-wrenching certainty that I was a pawn in a game far more sinister than I had imagined. Croft wasn't just prosecuting a case he thought he could win. He was prosecuting a case he knew was a lie. The closing arguments were Croft's victory lap. He strode back and forth in front of the jury box, a portrait of righteous indignation. He spoke of trust, of the sanctity of our city's great institutions, and of the cancer of greed that could corrupt even the most brilliant minds. He pointed at me, a long accusatory finger. "Do not let this man make a mockery of our university, of our city, of our justice system. Do not let him hide behind his tweed jackets and his fancy books." When it was over, the silence in the courtroom was heavy, suffocating. The jury filed out. Eleanor caught my eye and tried to mouth, "I love you," but her face was crumbling. We waited for 4 hours. It felt like a lifetime. When the jury filed back in, their faces were grim, unreadable. I stood, my legs feeling like they were made of stone. The foreman, a tired-looking man in a cheap suit, handed a slip of paper to the bailiff. The judge read it, his face betraying no emotion. He handed it back to the foreman. "In the matter of the Commonwealth versus Arthur Vance, on the charge of embezzlement, how do you find?" The foreman cleared his throat. He wouldn't look at me. He looked at a spot on the wall just above my head. "We find the defendant." "Guilty." A gasp escaped Eleanor's lips. The room started to spin. But before the darkness could take me, I looked at Julian Croft. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the reporters in the gallery, a small, tight, triumphant smile playing on his lips. He had won, and his story had just become my reality. The State Correctional Institution at Greaterford is a city of concrete and despair. The clang of steel doors became the punctuation of my days. I was no longer Professor Vance. I was inmate 77A342. The life I had known, the world of ideas, of scholarly debate, of Eleanor's warm presence beside me in the evening, was gone, replaced by a brutal, monotonous reality. The intellectual arrogance that Croft had accused me of was sand-blasted away within the first week. In prison, you learn humility quickly or you don't survive. My first few years were a haze of grief and disbelief. The worst blow came 6 months into my sentence. A letter from Eleanor's sister. Eleanor had had a massive stroke. She died before they could even get her to the hospital. The prison chaplain, a kind but weary man, told me the news in a small, windowless office. He said the stress of the trial, the shame, the financial ruin, it had been too much for her heart. There is no language to describe the hollowness that followed. It was a silence so profound it was a physical presence. She had believed in me and the fight had killed her. Julian Croft hadn't just taken my freedom. He had taken her life as surely as if he had held a gun to her head. That was the moment the grief began to harden into something else. It was a cold, quiet resolve that settled deep in my bones. I would not let them break me. I would not let Croft's lie be the final word on my life or hers. Greaterford had a surprisingly decent law library, a room that became my sanctuary. I'd been convicted by a story, and I became obsessed with deconstructing it page by page, lie by lie. I requested the full transcripts of my trial. When they arrived, a thick stack of bound paper, I felt a grim sense of purpose. I read every word. Croft's opening statement, the testimony, the fabricated evidence, the jury instructions. I learned the law. I studied appellate procedure, the rules of evidence, the precedents for prosecutorial misconduct. I started to see the flaws in Croft's masterpiece, the small inconsistencies in Salah's testimony that my overworked public defender had missed, the motions Ben had filed that were improperly dismissed, the subtle ways Croft had biased the jury pool during selection. Most of all, I saw the structure of the lie. Croft knew his case was weak on physical evidence, so he built it entirely around the narrative of my character and the credibility of his star witness. I filed appeal after appeal from my cell. Each one was meticulously researched, handwritten on yellow legal pads. And each one was denied. I was a convicted felon, a voice crying out from a legal abyss. No one was listening. But with each denial, my resolve only deepened. This was no longer about freedom. It was about the truth. I served 7 years of a 10 to 15-year sentence and was released on parole for good behavior. I walked out of Greaterford a different man. I was 40 years old, a widower, a convicted felon, and an academic pariah. My name was poison. I couldn't get a job teaching at a dog-obedience school, let alone a university. I ended up finding work at a used bookstore in Center City, Philadelphia, a quiet, dusty place where the past was my only companion. I lived in a small apartment above a laundromat, a life of monastic simplicity. And I watched as Julian Croft's career skyrocketed. He rode the fame of my conviction to become the district attorney of Philadelphia. He was hailed as a crusader, a tough-on-crime prosecutor who put villains away. Every time I saw his face in the newspaper or on the local news, accepting an award or announcing a new indictment, the cold ember in my chest would glow a little hotter. I kept a scrapbook, not of memories but of injustices. Every article about Croft's successes went into it. I would read about his beautiful wife, his 2 accomplished children who went to Ivy League schools, his vacation home on the Jersey Shore. I was documenting the life he had built on the ruins of mine, decades past. My hair turned grey, then white. The world changed, but my routine did not. I worked at the bookstore, I lived my quiet life, and I never stopped my research. The law library at the Free Library of Philadelphia became my new home. I was no longer inmate 77A342. I was just a quiet old man who spent his days poring over legal archives and public records. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. A pattern, maybe. A sign that what Croft had done to me wasn't an anomaly, but a method. I investigated his other major cases from his time as an ADA. I spent years tracing the lives of the people he had convicted, the witnesses he had used. Most were dead ends. But my historian's training had taught me one thing above all else: patience. The past always leaves a trace. You just have to know where to look. Then came the invitation, tucked inside a copy of the Alumni Quarterly magazine from my old university. The Pennsylvania Bar Association was honoring one of its own, the Honorable Judge Julian Croft, the keynote speaker at a gala celebrating his 50-year career. I looked at the glossy photo of him, the same arrogant confidence now framed by the distinguished lines of age. And I knew I had to go. I had to see him one last time. I had to stand in the same room and hear the lies one more time. That night after the gala, after his dismissive glance and his speech about truth, I went home to my small apartment. The city lights of Philadelphia reflected softly on the window. I didn't turn on the lights. I walked to the old steamer trunk at the foot of my bed. I lifted the heavy lid. Inside was my life's work. Not the books I had written on economic history, but the meticulous, cross-referenced files on Julian Croft, the trial transcripts, my failed appeals, the newspaper clippings, my notes on his other cases. For 40 years, it had been an archive of my own despair. But tonight, looking at it all, I saw it differently. It wasn't an archive of defeat. It was an arsenal. Croft was a judge now, a powerful, respected man on the verge of a federal appointment. He was untouchable. But he had made one critical mistake. He had forgotten about me. He had assumed that the story he wrote for me 40 years ago was the one I would quietly live out until I died. He was wrong. The historian in me was finally ready to publish. The first rule of dissecting a life is to start at the beginning. My revenge would not be a single dramatic act of confrontation. It would be a patient, meticulous, academic dismantling of Julian Croft's entire legacy. He had built his career on a series of carefully constructed narratives, and I would deconstruct them, citation by citation, until only the ugly truth remained. My quiet life had given me 2 invaluable assets: time and anonymity. I was a ghost, a 72-year-old former bookstore clerk who the world had forgotten. I could move through the city's archives, the libraries, and the public record databases without raising any suspicion. My first target was not my own case, but Croft's other victories from that era. A prosecutor with a taste for fabrication rarely uses the recipe just once. I spent 6 months buried in the microfiche archives of the Philadelphia Inquirer at the Free Library, cross-referencing every case Croft tried between 1974 and 1980 with court dockets and witness lists. I was looking for a specific signature, a high-profile case, a conviction resting almost entirely on the testimony of a single, seemingly unimpeachable witness. I found it in the winter of 1977. The Commonwealth versus Franklin Gable. Gable was a union official accused of accepting bribes to rig a construction contract. The case against him was circumstantial, except for the testimony of his bookkeeper, a man named Roger Hobbs. Hobbs claimed he had personally delivered cash payments to Gable on multiple occasions. Croft painted Hobbs as a brave whistleblower, a man of conscience. Gable was convicted and served 12 years. It was a mirror image of my own trial. On the surface, it was just another one of Croft's wins. But I dug deeper. Using property records and old court filings, I spent weeks tracing what happened to Roger Hobbs after the trial. And then I found it. 6 months after Gable's conviction, Hobbs was arrested for running a check kiting scheme. It should have been a serious felony charge, but the case was handled by the DA's office, Croft's office. Hobbs was allowed to plead down to a misdemeanor, served no jail time, and paid minimal restitution. It was a quid pro quo hidden in plain sight. Croft had paid his star witness with a get-out-of-jail-free card. Finding Roger Hobbs 40 years later was the next challenge. He wasn't in any public databases. I assumed he was likely dead. But historians are trained to follow the paper. I traced his last known address to a property his wife sold in the late 90s. From there, I followed her trail, which eventually led me to an obituary. It mentioned she was survived by a son who lived in Fishtown. A few more searches, and I had the son's address. I didn't call. This was something that had to be done in person. I took the Market Frankfurt line to Girard Station and walked the last few blocks. The house was a small, tidy brick row house, the kind that fills the old working-class neighborhoods of Philadelphia. I stood on the sidewalk for a full 10 minutes, my heart pounding in my chest. This was the first real step out of the shadows. I was no longer a passive researcher. I was an active participant in my own history. I walked up the marble steps and knocked. The man who answered was in his 60s, with his father's weary eyes. I simply asked if he was Roger Hobbs's son. When he confirmed, I said, "My name is Arthur Vance. I believe your father and I have a mutual acquaintance, Judge Julian Croft." The color drained from his face. He ushered me inside, his hands trembling. Roger Hobbs was not dead. He was 85 years old, living in a nursing home in South Jersey, his mind ravaged by dementia, but his conscience, his son told me, had been tormented for decades by what he did to Franklin Gable. The son explained that his father had been caught in the check kiting scheme before the Gable trial. Croft had found out and used it as leverage. Testify and the charges disappear. Refuse, and he'd go to prison for a very long time. Roger Hobbs had a young family. He made a deal with the devil. For 40 years, the guilt had consumed him. I knew I couldn't get a reliable statement from Roger himself, not with his dementia. But his son, a decent man haunted by his father's sin, remembered everything. He remembered the hushed, panicked phone calls. He remembered Croft visiting their house late one night. He was willing to talk. This was my cornerstone, the proof of a pattern. But it wasn't enough. A story about a 40-year-old case based on the hearsay of a remorseful son would be dismissed. I needed something current, something that would prove that the ambitious, corrupt ADA had simply evolved into an ambitious, corrupt judge. I needed to investigate the money. Croft was wealthy, but his judge's salary couldn't account for his multi-million-dollar home in Rittenhouse Square or his collection of antique cars. This part of the investigation was beyond my skills. I was a historian, not a forensic accountant. I needed a partner, and I knew exactly where to find one. I went back to my old haunting grounds, the campus of the University of Pennsylvania. I found my way to the offices of the Daily Pennsylvanian, the student newspaper. I asked to speak to the top investigative reporter. They introduced me to a young woman named Sarah Jenkins. She was sharp, ambitious, and had a healthy dose of skepticism in her eyes. She reminded me of a young Eleanor. I didn't tell her who I was. I introduced myself as a retired historical researcher working on a book about the Philadelphia justice system from the 1970s to the present day. I told her I had stumbled upon some potential judicial misconduct and needed a collaborator with modern research skills. I laid out the Gable case, the coerced witness, the buried charges against Hobbs. I showed her the documents, the timeline, the evidence of the cover-up. I watched her as she read. Her skepticism slowly melted away, replaced by the hungry gleam of a journalist who knows they're onto a massive story. "This is incredible," she breathed, looking up from the files. "But it's old. To publish this, we'd need something that connects it to now, something that proves the rot is still there." I smiled. "That, Miss Jenkins, is precisely why I'm here. I believe Judge Croft has found more sophisticated ways to get paid for his verdicts. I need you to help me follow the money." Our partnership was forged right there, in the cluttered, coffee-stained offices of a student newspaper. The old ghost and the young reporter. Together, we were going to drag Julian Croft's pristine reputation into the light. And I knew, with a certainty that settled every nerve in my body, that it would not survive the exposure. Our alliance began with a single, guiding principle I had learned from my years studying economic history. Powerful men don't change their nature, they only refine their methods. Julian Croft was no longer a young ADA coercing witnesses in backrooms. He was a sophisticated judge, and his corruption, I wagered, would be equally sophisticated. I tasked Sarah with the digital world, a realm where I was a hopeless immigrant. Her first objective was to map out Croft's entire financial and social network. Using publicly available information, social media, and subscription databases accessible to the university, she built a complex web of his connections, his family, his friends, the lawyers who frequently appeared in his courtroom, the clubs he belonged to, the charities he sat on the board of. It was a staggering portrait of Philadelphia's elite. Meanwhile, I stuck to what I knew, paper. I spent weeks in the city's property and commerce archives, examining every business filing and real estate transaction connected to Croft's inner circle. We were looking for a hub, a central point where money could flow in discreetly. Sarah found it first. A boutique private equity firm called Crestview Capital. It was run by a man named Martin Thorne, who was married to Croft's wife's sister, his brother-in-law. On the surface, it was a legitimate, if unremarkable, investment firm. But as Sarah dug into its portfolio, a pattern emerged. Crestview had made a series of highly successful, almost prescient investments in small, local companies. One was a construction subcontractor, another a biotech startup, and a third was a real estate development company. She cross-referenced these companies with the cases that had appeared before Judge Croft. The connection was stunningly clear. In each instance, a company Crestview invested in had been a party to litigation in Croft's court, either directly or indirectly. And in each case, Croft had issued a ruling that dramatically benefited that company, a zoning variance approved, a crucial patent lawsuit decided in their favor, a competitor's contract voided. After each favorable ruling, the value of Crestview's investment soared. Martin Thorne was getting rich, and by extension, so was the Croft family. It was bribery, laundered through the seemingly legitimate mechanism of private equity. "He's not taking cash in an envelope," Sarah said, her voice electric with discovery during one of our late-night meetings at a 24-hour diner. "He's trading verdicts for insider information. He tells Thorne which way a case is going to go. Thorne invests before the ruling is public, and they all cash out. It's brilliant, and almost impossible to prove. Almost. That was the word that hung in the air. We had the pattern, but we needed a direct link. We needed someone on the inside to talk. That's when my historical research paid another dividend. The construction subcontractor that had received the first big payout from a Croft ruling, a company called Pendelton Sons, had gone bankrupt 5 years later due to mismanagement. I suspected that if we could find the former CFO, he might have a story to tell. A man who had his golden parachute ripped away might hold a grudge. Finding him took me 3 weeks. His name was Gerald Finney, and he was now running a small accounting business out of a strip mall in Delaware County. I went to see him, again using my cover as a historical researcher. I didn't lead with Croft. I simply told him I was researching the boom and bust of local construction firms in the early 2000s. I let him talk for an hour about the good old days at Pendelton Sons, about the big contracts and the rapid growth. Then I casually mentioned the lawsuit that had made them. "That was an incredible win for you," I said. "The zoning appeal. I read the ruling. Judge Croft really saved your company. Finney's face soured. Yeah, the judge, he said with a sneer. He saved us all right, I leaned in. What do you mean? He hesitated, looking at me, this harmless old man. He probably thought I was just a curious academic. He let out a long, weary sigh. Our lawyer told us we had no shot at winning that appeal, he said, his voice low. Then one day, my boss, Mr. Pennock, comes in smiling. Says it's all been handled. A week later, we get a call from some fancy firm called Crestview Capital. They want to buy a 30% stake in the company for pennies on the dollar. Pennock tells me to make it happen. 2 months later, Judge Croft reverses the zoning board, and our property value triples overnight. Crestview made a fortune. He paused, shaking his head. I asked Mr. Pennock how he knew. He just told me it was the cost of doing business in this city. That was it. That was the link. It was still hearsay, but it was coming from a C-level executive. It was the human element we needed to make the financial data come alive. While I was chasing down Finney, Sarah made a breakthrough of her own. She had been digging into Croft's personal life, looking for any other vulnerability. She discovered that Croft was in the final stages of being vetted for a nomination to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. It was the crowning achievement of his career. The confirmation hearings were scheduled to begin in Washington, D.C. in less than a month. The news sent a jolt of panic and opportunity through me. Our timeline had just been drastically accelerated. Croft's entire life and career were about to be placed under the most powerful microscope in the country. A U.S. Senate confirmation hearing. This is our stage, Arthur, Sarah said, her eyes wide with the enormity of it. We can't just leak this to a local paper. We have to go bigger. We write the entire story. Your wrongful conviction, the Gable case, the financial scheme with Crestview Capital. We build an airtight case with sworn affidavits from Gable's son and Gerald Finney. We publish it ourselves on a dedicated website the morning his hearing begins. It was a terrifyingly bold plan. All our work, our entire conspiracy would be laid bare. There would be no hiding from me anymore. My name would be attached to it. The world would know that inmate 77A342 had come back from the dead. I looked at this brilliant, fearless young woman and thought of Eleanor. I thought of the promise I had made to her in the silence of my cell. The ember in my chest was now a roaring fire. Let's get to work, I said. We have a judge to unconfirm. The next 3 weeks were a frantic, sleepless race against the clock. We operated like fugitives, meeting in quiet corners of libraries and late-night cafes, communicating through encrypted apps. Sarah worked on building a simple, professional-looking website to host our story, a digital bombshell we called the Croft File. She began weaving together the narrative, connecting the threads from my wrongful conviction in 1975 to the ongoing financial conspiracy. My role was to secure the final pieces of evidence, the sworn affidavits. I first went back to the son of Roger Hobbs, the coerced witness from the Gable trial. I explained the full scope of what we had found and what we planned to do. He was terrified, but the thought of his father's legacy being one of a liar and the chance to posthumously help an innocent man gave him courage. He agreed to sign a statement, detailing everything his father had confessed to him over the years about Croft's threats. Getting Gerald Finney, the former CFO of Pennock & Sons, to sign was harder. He was afraid of the repercussions. I had to appeal not to his conscience, but to his anger. I reminded him how he had been cast aside when the company went under, while Croft and his friends had walked away with millions. This isn't just about justice, Mr. Finney, I told him, sitting in his drab little office. It's about payback. That resonated. He signed. We now had 3 pillars for our story, my own meticulously documented case, the corroborating story of a second coerced witness, and the testimony of a corporate insider exposing the financial rot. Sarah wrote with a fury and precision that left me in awe. She transformed my mountains of dry research into a compelling, damning narrative, complete with scanned documents, timelines, and photographs. As the date of the confirmation hearing approached, the pressure became immense. We were 2 people against a powerful, entrenched system. There was a constant, gnawing fear that we had missed something, that Croft would find a way to discredit us, to paint me as a vengeful crank and Sarah as a reckless student journalist. The night before the hearing, we met for the last time. The website was finished, loaded, and ready to go live with the push of a button. Sarah had already sent a protected link and a short, explosive summary to the lead investigative producer at a national news network and, more importantly, to the Chief of Staff for the ranking minority member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. We weren't just publishing it. We were aiming it like a rifle at the people who could do the most damage. "Are you ready for this, Arthur?" Sarah asked, her face pale in the glow of the laptop screen. "Once I hit this button, your life is going to change forever. You won't be a ghost anymore." I thought about the last 40 years. The quiet solitude of the bookstore, the anonymity, the life I had built in the ruins of the old one. It had been a safe place, a long grey purgatory. But I wasn't that man anymore. "Eleanor's been waiting a long time for this day," I said softly. "Push the button, Sarah." She took a deep breath and clicked the mouse. And just like that, 4 decades of silence were broken. The next morning, I didn't go to the library. I sat in my small apartment, the television tuned to the live broadcast of the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing. The room was packed. Julian Croft sat at the witness table, flanked by his wife and children, the very picture of judicial eminence. The hearing began with fawning introductions from his home state senators. They spoke of his integrity, his wisdom, his unwavering commitment to the rule of law. Croft smiled, humble and gracious. For the first hour, it was a coronation. Then the ranking minority member, a stern-faced senator from Vermont, began her round of questioning. She adjusted her glasses and looked down at a folder in front of her. "Judge Croft," she began, her voice calm but edged with steel. "I'd like to ask you about your time as an assistant district attorney in Philadelphia. Specifically, are you familiar with the case from 1975, the Commonwealth versus Arthur Vance?" I saw Croft's shoulders tense, just for a second. His smile became a little more rigid. "That was a long time ago, Senator," he said smoothly. "But yes, I recall the case. A university professor convicted of embezzlement." The senator looked up from her folder, her eyes boring into him. "And are you aware, Judge, of a website that went live approximately 2 hours ago, which alleges in meticulous detail that you suborned perjury and fabricated evidence to secure that conviction, and that it was part of a pattern of misconduct that has continued throughout your career?" A murmur went through the room. Aides started furiously tapping on their phones. I could see Croft's composure begin to crack. The color was draining from his face. "Senator, I am aware of no such thing," he stammered. "I can only assume this is a baseless, last-minute smear campaign from some disgruntled felon." The senator leaned forward into her microphone. "Well, this disgruntled felon has provided sworn affidavits, financial records, and corroborating testimony. I am holding a printout of the executive summary right here. It also details a bribery and insider trading scheme involving a firm called Crestview Capital, run by your brother-in-law. Would you care to comment on that, Judge?" It was over. I knew it in that moment. On live national television, his entire world was imploding. He started to bluster, to deny, but the damage was done. The reporters in the room were no longer listening to him. They were reading Sarah's story on their phones, their faces a mask of shock and excitement. The story was out. The truth was out. And it was more powerful than any lie he had ever told. The committee chairman, looking flustered, called for a recess. As the cameras zoomed in on Julian Croft's face, I saw the man I remembered from the trial 40 years earlier. Not the confident, powerful judge, but the cornered liar, the hollow man. His face a rictus of panic and disbelief as the narrative he had controlled for so long was finally, irrevocably ripped from his hands. The aftermath was a whirlwind. The confirmation hearing was suspended indefinitely. Within hours, the Croft file had been picked up by every major news organization in the country. My name, Arthur Vance, was suddenly everywhere, no longer a forgotten footnote, but the central figure in a national scandal. The U.S. Department of Justice launched an investigation into the bribery allegations. The Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, under immense public pressure, announced the formation of a special commission to review not just my case, but every major conviction Julian Croft had ever secured. His life's work was being systematically dismantled, his legacy turning to ash before his eyes. He was suspended from the bench pending the outcome of the judicial review. The man who had been a pillar of the city's legal community was now a pariah, hounded by reporters every time he left his Rittenhouse Square fortress. Sarah became an overnight star. She was hailed as a journalistic prodigy, fielding job offers from the very national publications she had initially scooped. She handled it all with a grace and maturity that belied her years, always making sure to steer the narrative back to the facts, back to the victims. For me, the experience was surreal. After a lifetime in the shadows, I was suddenly thrust into the light. Lawyers from the Innocence Project took on my case. It wasn't a fight. The evidence of Salah's perjury, combined with the sworn statement from Hobbs's son about a similar pattern of coercion, was overwhelming. The DA's office didn't even contest it. 3 months after the disastrous hearing, I stood in the same courthouse where I had been convicted. This time, the room was filled not with accusers, but with supporters. The judge, a woman who looked at me with an expression of profound sorrow for the system she represented, read her ruling. The conviction of Mr. Arthur Vance is hereby vacated. All charges are dismissed with prejudice. The court extends its deepest apologies to Mr. Vance for the grave miscarriage of justice he has suffered. She looked at me directly. You are a free and innocent man, Mr. Vance. I am so sorry it took so long. I felt no elation, no triumphant surge of victory, just a quiet, profound sense of release. A 40-year-old weight had been lifted from my soul. It was the closing of a circle. Julian Croft was ultimately disbarred and indicted on federal racketeering charges alongside his brother-in-law. His wife divorced him. His reputation, the thing he had valued above all else, was permanently destroyed. He was no longer the Honorable Judge Croft. He was just a disgraced old man waiting for a new, far less prestigious title, federal inmate. My own life found a new, quiet equilibrium. The university issued a formal apology and established a scholarship in Eleanor's name for library sciences. It was a gesture, but a meaningful one. I didn't want my old job back. That part of my life was a country to which I could never return. I continued to live in my small apartment, but it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a home. I had my books, my peace, and my name back. One evening, about a year after my exoneration, I was sitting by my window reading. The city hummed below, a familiar and comforting sound. Sarah, who still visited me for coffee every few weeks, had sent me an advance copy of her first book. It was an expansion of the Croft file, a deep dive into the systemic failures that allowed men like him to flourish. She had dedicated it to my wife. The phone rang. It was a reporter from the local paper. He told me that Julian Croft, out on bail and facing a trial he knew he could not win, had taken his own life that afternoon. I thanked the reporter for the information and hung up the phone. I felt nothing. No pity, no satisfaction, no closure. His story was over, but it had ceased to be a part of mine the day my conviction was overturned. I looked around my room, at the shelves overflowing with books, the comfortable old armchair, the photograph of Eleanor on my desk, her smile as bright as I remembered. I had my life back. I walked over to my bookshelf, to the history section. I pulled down a thick, heavy volume on the American legal system. I opened it and took out the small, worn leather book from inside. My annotated trial transcripts, the companion to my long years in the wilderness. I held it for a moment, then walked to the fireplace. I tossed it in and watched as 40 years of pain, anger, and obsession curled into smoke and vanished up the chimney. He had stolen decades of my history, so I made sure my name would be the only thing written on the last page of his. The end.